As Canadian warplanes prepare to deploy in the Middle East, we look at the effectiveness of airstrikes. Also, the story of the aging CF-18s being pressed into combat. I'm Affan Chowdhry. Welcome to Globe Now. By the end of October, Canada's combat mission in Iraq will be in place. Kuwait is where 6 CF-18 warplanes will be based. The mission timeline, 6 months, and the target, Islamic State militants in Iraq. So, is the airstrike strategy still the best option to blunt Islamic State fighters? And what happens after the airstrikes? Professor Roland Paris is director of the Centre for International Policy Studies at the University of Ottawa. Hi, Professor.
Hi there. Hi.
It's been several weeks since the Harper government made this commitment. How effective do you think airstrikes will be?
Well, it's very hard to say. So far, there have been a number of airstrikes in both Iraq and Syria, and it's possible that they're blunting the advance of ISIS. But the real question here is, what is the longer-term strategy? I think the Americans have indicated from the very beginning that the airstrikes are really just the first phase of a much longer-term enterprise that involves training up ground forces that can actually fight against ISIS on the ground in Iraq, training up moderate ground forces in Syria, a much longer-term enterprise even than in Iraq, and then also promoting the continuation of reforms within the Iraqi government to make the government more inclusive, including of the Sunnis in Iraq. And winning the Sunnis over is critical to actually ejecting ISIS from the country. So there's lots of elements to this strategy beyond the airstrikes.
I mean, let's start with the airstrikes. We've already seen other countries carry out airstrikes. What has been the lesson from that?
Well, I think it's early days still, and the relatively low intensity of airstrikes in terms of numbers compared to previous missions. I think, one of the lessons of airstrikes in the past, if you look at 2001 in Afghanistan, when the United States deployed special operations forces basically with Afghan units and used air power to support those Afghan units, or in Libya, when basically NATO provided the air force for the Libyan rebels who did the ground fighting, that in certain kinds of geographical conditions, namely open ground, like the conditions in western Iraq, air power can be a very important element of an overall operation. But so far, I think what we've seen is that air power has helped to prevent ISIS from advancing any further, and it's protected, for the moment, the Kurdish enclave in northern Syria of Kobani. But I think it's very unlikely that there'll be any really significant rollback of ISIS's presence in Syria or Iraq in the absence of effective ground forces.
I mean, it's interesting. We talk about the long-term strategy. General Tom Lawson, the Chief of Defense Staff, said on Friday that airstrike power alone will not deal with Islamic State militants. He talked about training Iraqi forces to continue the fight on the ground. I mean, to what extent do you think that's a better, more comprehensive strategy?
Well, I think that, he was, in a sense, echoing what many people have been saying about air power alone not being enough to defeat ISIS. I think that's a given. It's noteworthy that General Lawson had just a few days earlier been at a meeting in Washington, D.C. of military leaders from countries that are contributing to the coalition of nations fighting in Iraq. And that meeting in Washington was chaired by President Obama. And the purpose of the meeting was basically to get everybody on the same page in terms of the larger strategy. So to have General Lawson, in a sense, come back and have a press conference is, in a way, communicating, I think, the broader approach that's shared among the different countries. And it's clearly one that includes training. Now, we know that Canada has as many as 69 special operations forces in Iraq providing this kind of training and assistance. The real critical question is whether Canadian troops may be moved into on tactical missions or might end up in frontline positions. And the government has said there will be no ground combat operations for Canada. But even at that press conference you mentioned, there was a little bit of ambiguity about what Canadian forces will actually be doing on the ground in Iraq.
Professor, thank you so much.
Pleasure.
Well, we want to hear from you. How comfortable are you with Canada's combat mission to Iraq? And do you think the airstrike strategy will succeed? Tweet us at Globe Now. So, half a dozen CF-18 warplanes are being pressed into action. The CF-18s have been around since the 1980s, and their age and wear and tear has been worrying to some. Here's a brief history of the Canadian jet fighter.
Canadian air power is part of the combat mission in Iraq. That includes 6 CF-18 fighters and 600 support personnel. Their target, Islamic State militants. And their home for the next 6 months, Camp Canada in Kuwait. The aircraft was designed in the 1970s for the U.S. Navy and Marines. Delivery of Canada's first CF-18s started in 1982. In total, there were 138 jet fighters. Today's fleet, 77, the result of crashes and aircraft being retired. The CF-18 is a twin-engine aircraft that can reach speeds of up to Mach 1.8. It has enough thrust to lift 24 pickup trucks. It can target other jet fighters as well as targets on the ground.
Good hit.
24 CF-18s took part in the First Iraq War between 1990 and 1991. 18 flew combat missions over Kosovo in 1999. 7 were part of the NATO-led mission to enforce a no-fly zone and arms embargo in Libya that helped topple dictator Muammar Gaddafi in 2011. The CF-18s dropped 696 bombs, tallying 10% of all NATO strike missions in Libya. And that led to a lot of worry about wear and tear on the aging jet fighter. Upgrades were completed in 2006 and 2010. There's since been a lot of discussion about replacing the CF-18s. What to replace them with, and at what cost? Well, Ottawa is still figuring that one out.
That's all for today's show. If you've got a moment, hop onto Twitter. What do you think Canada should do about its aging CF-18 fleet? Tweet us at Globe Now. I'm Affan Chowdhry. Thanks for watching.